Well, hello, and thanks for joining me today. This is going to be the first video in a three-video series that overall I'll call the Atlantic World. And what we'll be looking at in this short three-video series are some of the big types of changes and connections and interactions that started to happen once European countries began to establish themselves in what is today North and South America. So with today's topic, we're going to focus on something called the Columbian Exchange and some of the new things that started to develop as a result of it. All right, so first of all, just with the concept of the Columbian Exchange, that's really just a reference to the transfer of food and plants and animals and just everything that could be transferred from one part of the world to the other. One thing that might be kind of hard to imagine today was that before Europeans began to make contact with what is today North and South America, there were a lot of things that were unique in the world to one region or another. So, for example, things that might be found in Europe and Asia and Africa, in many cases, weren't present at all in North and South America. And then the same is true that there were some things in North and South America that were not present at all in Europe, Asia, and Africa. But as people started transferring back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, lots of different things started to travel back and forth as well. Now, this picture might be a little bit hard to see because some of the writing is a little bit long, but it's designed to show just some examples of things that at one point in time were just in one part of the world, but would transfer to the other and become something that was found everywhere. And in many cases, there are things that we probably are pretty familiar with today where we live, assuming you're watching this from America, and might find it surprising that for a long time it wasn't found here. For example, things that we think of as pretty normal, especially around here in Kansas, things like grains, wheat, for example, in particular, livestock like cattle, sheep, pigs, horses. Those are all things that didn't used to be here in the Americas, but now are very much a regular part of how we do things. You might think of citrus fruits like oranges, like Florida orange juice, and really almost think of oranges in Florida as being synonymous with each other. But in reality, oranges have only been in places like Florida for a relatively short amount of time. But then there were a lot of things that used to just be in this part of the world that transferred over. For example, tomatoes. That was something that you probably think of Italian food and pizza or things like that with tomato sauce. Tomato sauce in Italy, at least, it has been a relatively new development because it's only been in the last several hundred years that places in Europe would even have access to tomatoes. But potatoes, corn, those are things that were all present just here in the Americas that would transfer back and forth. So in many cases, a lot of really positive transfers. Probably the most negative example of transfer from one side to another was in the form of disease. There were a lot of diseases like smallpox, typhus, measles, malaria. Those were all present in Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries, but weren't at all found in North and South America. Those would inadvertently travel with people across and unfortunately infect a lot of people and lead to a lot of death and illness and suffering because people who encountered those for the first time had no natural immunities built up whatsoever, and so it proved to be very devastating. But through the good and through the bad, a lot of things were exchanged. And of course, we now live in a world today where there really isn't anything that's totally unique to one part of the world or another because we basically have the ability to access all those things today. Now, thinking more specifically in the moment, for Europeans in particular, one of the interests that they had in making some connections with other parts of the world was to get access to more food and more food sources. And one thing that did come back across to Europe that was beneficial, at least in terms of calories, was being able to bring back corn and potatoes. They're relatively cheap, relatively easy to grow foods. And one thing you saw in Europe once they arrived was a pretty dramatic population increase. Because one thing that seems to hold pretty true, if you don't have things to eat, you don't tend to stay alive very long. So when you start having more steady food, you'll definitely see your population numbers increase. But as I mentioned before with this previous slide, in the Americas, probably the most impactful thing, at least in the short term, to travel across from Europe, Asia, and Africa was disease, which unfortunately was pretty devastating. Now, moving on, I just want to touch on a couple of other things real quick that were a relevant part of this whole Columbian Exchange and these new connections that were taking place between really East and West, eastern side of the Atlantic Ocean to the western side of the Atlantic Ocean. And so one of the things we see is what you can overall call a commercial revolution, just the overseas trade that would increase and would definitely have, at least in the short term, the most direct impact on Europe and the wealth of Europe. Now, something that we'll get to at a later point in the course is talking more specifically about economic systems. One of the systems that we will get into in greater detail will be capitalism. And one thing about this newly developing commercial revolution is it created an opportunity for elements of what we associate with capitalism to really begin to take shape. With capitalism, in the simplest terms, you're talking about a free economic system that pretty much is driven by what do people want, what are people able to provide, and are people willing to give what's needed to get what they want. And in its purest form, there aren't any rules or regulations about how it operates. It's really just about a voluntary exchange between people that want something and people that have something that people want. And one of the big things that started representing a bit of a change here compared to what was true before capitalism started to develop is it was a system where it wasn't just the government or the kings, people like that held the wealth and held all of the control by virtue of wealth, but allowed for private individuals to have ownership in something, whether it was individual ownership or whether it was a collective ownership, like through a joint stock company. But people had an opportunity to engage in business activities to make their own personal profit. Now, there's also the opportunity for loss too, but focusing on the positive at this point, this was a new opportunity for a growing number of people to acquire wealth, something that just hadn't really been true prior to this time. And so, and as I was saying, the biggest change was as the years went by, it wasn't just governments and people like kings that had access to wealth, but you saw a growing number of individuals be able to start accessing wealth as well. Now, I mentioned the joint stock company here just a second ago. One of the things that would begin to develop during this time of individual opportunity to grow wealth was the formation of the joint stock company. One of the realities, if you wanted to get involved with trade overseas, which was a good money-making opportunity at this point, or at least a potential money-making opportunity, is it was expensive. To get things up and running was very expensive. Not very many people on their own had enough resources to make a go of it by themselves. But if you had a group of people that had the same idea, pool their resources together, they would be able to, in a sense, then collectively get involved with a business venture. And when it says there less risk and less reward, basically what it meant was people could get into the business of overseas trade by only maybe kicking in, say, 10% of what it costs to do it. Now, so less risk if things fell apart. And on the less reward side, they would have to share whatever profits they made, in theory, with everybody else in equal shares, or at least shares equal to what they put into it. In a lot of ways, this was kind of the precursor to the modern day corporation, which again is something that we'll address in a little more detail at a later point. Now, something else to mention here, and then we'll wrap things up with this video, was the concept of mercantilism. This would really begin to take shape during this time, and this was really kind of a country-to-country perspective, and it was a perspective that focused on power. And the way they defined power with mercantilism was that wealth equaled power. So the more wealth a country had, the more powerful they were. And there were really a couple of different ways to generate this wealth and thus have greater power. And so a big part of the focus during this time for many countries was to either get as much gold and silver as possible. That was a clearly defined example of power. The other thing that these countries were trying to do was to gain a favorable balance of trade, to get into a position as a country where they were selling more things than they were buying. And so that's where the development of colonies really come into play. and developing the territories that these countries were coming under control of would become very important, because if they could gather resources from these countries to be a part of what they were selling abroad, that helped them have a favorable balance of trade. All right, so that's where I'm going to finish things for right now. The next video is going to focus on the Atlantic slave trade, which will become a practice that will be a big part of countries, for example, establishing a favorable balance of trade. So hopefully you'll join me for the next video. Thanks for watching.